All right, let's go over a Game of Thrones. I've been meaning to reread a Game of Thrones for a while now. It seems like when I get questions on stuff, everything takes me back to Dance and Feast. But I've been meaning to go back and read the story from the beginning one more time, just to kind of catch a few forgotten plots and things like that. I just think it would be interesting. And so, well, yeah, let's do that. Let's read a Game of Thrones here and see what we see. I've been doing these breakdowns of the fanfic chapters, so I thought maybe I'd do the same thing with a Game of Thrones. Now, for a Game of Thrones has a lot of chapters. I think it has the most chapters of the novels, but the chapters are shorter significantly. And so this prologue, for example, that we're going to go over today, it's only 3,800 words. By comparison, like the Clash of Kings prologue is over 10,000. And generally speaking, the average chapter in these later books becomes around 5,500 words. And so um, this is things are very brief and short in a Game of Thrones. Um, we don't get the travel logs and things like that that we get later on. George changes his writing style. Now, A Game of Thrones was written. He began it in the year 1991. He really started in earnest in 94, and the reason there is this gap there is because he stopped to work on a pilot called Doorways, and but he did write like the first 200 pages of A Game of Thrones as early as in 91, 92. And this is significant as this prologue it's not the first chapter he wrote. We don't know in what order he wrote them, other than that Bran 1 was the first chapter he wrote. So prologue came after, but prologue, it was probably in that early batch of 200 pages. And so, which is interesting because this chapter very much resembles the opening chapter of a Wildcards book that George R. Martin wrote called Dead Man's Hand. And in that story, the main character is having a dream of walking through a dark forest at night and coming upon a monster in the dark forest. And so it's just very striking when you begin a story in a dark, and that book came out, I think that book was published in 1990. And so you keep in mind that he's writing this in 91. It hadn't actually been too long, but it's very striking to think like, oh, to begin a book with and then have a character in a dark, scary forest, like running into a monster. Um, so there's a lot of, not that there's any lines that are similar, but you can read the two side by side and be like, huh, yeah, no, I definitely get the feeling of that. So, if you ever want to read Dead Man's Hand or the beginning, it's kind of interesting. So prologue. We should start back. Garrett urged as the woods began to grow dark around them. The wildlings are dead. So George R. Martin was a short story writer, and he was very focused on first lines and last lines. And keep in mind, this is the first line of his whole series, and often the first line is the thing that people think about the most. It's often not just the theme of the chapter, but it's going to perhaps be the theme of the book, if not the series. And so when you think about this line, we should start back. The wildlings are dead. Yeah, this is supposed to, first lines are supposed to pull you in. But at the same time, like George is thinking thematically here. And so I do wonder, and I have no proof of this, but that line, we should start back. If knowing that now that there's time travel in the Song of Ice and Fire series, it's kind of funny to have that line, we should start back, as if like, if he's actually talking about time travel in that first line of the story. But we're introduced to the character of a character of the prologue. The prologue's actually from Will's perspective, but we're introduced to Garrett first, who wants to head back, and the wildlings are dead, and we're introduced to the main kind of thing to pull you in. Why are the wildlings dead? And then we get, do the dead frighten you? Sir Raymar Royce asked with a hint of a smile. And this is kind of an ironic wink to the audience already, which is funny because it's like the second line of the series that our author is winking at us, that this is a series about dead people, and do the dead frighten us. And keep in mind that when George is writing this, he's thinking that this is going to be a trilogy. He's thinking that based on his outline, we know that the third book was about the invasion of the others. He very much thought this was going to be a book about zombies and dead people and perhaps time travel. But, we kind of know later that it gets off course, and in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, the dead and the others play a very small role. But there's, in this typical thing of what do you need to establish in the beginning of your story? You need to establish like a hook, you need to establish setting and stuff like this. And so you can see a lot of work being done here quite quickly to establish like what this book is about and the setting that they're in. We should start back. Do the dead frighten you? Waymar Royce winking at us. But right off the back, we have the conflict of Garrett versus Royce as the point of this prologue. And you can see how efficient George R. Martin is. Within 2 lines, we have what this chapter is about and the conflict of the chapter right there to pull us in. Garrett did not rise to the bait. He was an old man past 50, and he had seen the lordlings come and go. Dead is dead. We have no business with the dead. And here's the interesting thing. Now, Garrett is experienced. He's 50 years old. He's an old man. And we know that the lordling is young. And so we have a contrast of old and young, experience and inexperience. Are they dead? Royce asked softly. What proof do we have? The logic of this supposedly educated man, Will saw them, Garrett said. If he says they're dead, that's proof enough for me. Will had known they would drag him into this quarrel sooner or later. He wished it had been later rather than sooner. My mother told me that dead men sing no songs, he put in. Dead Men Sing No Songs is a short story collection by this. I think it's called The Songs That Dead Men Sing by George R. Martin. It's just a bunch of his short stories together. So he's stealing this line from his own writing. Dead men sing no songs. The songs that dead men sing. My wet nurse said the same thing. Will, Royce replied, never believe anything you hear at a woman's tit. There are things to be learned. There are things to be learned from the dead. Too loud in the twilight forest. We have a long ride before us, 8 days, maybe 9, and the night is falling. So Raymar Royce glanced at the sky with disinterest. It does that every day about this time. Are you unmanned by the dark, Garrett? Will could see the tightness around Garrett's mouth, that barely suppressed his anger in his eyes, under the thick black hood of his cloak. Garrett had spent 40 years in the night's watch. Man and boy, he was not accustomed to being made light of. Yet it was more than that. Under the wounded pride, Will could sense something else in the older man. He could taste it, nervous tension that came perilously close to fear. And so here we have an interesting, because again, this prologue is the main function is to establish setting. And what's interesting here is that we're establishing setting between Garrett and Waymar Royce, which is the conflict of the chapter. And we're establishing setting. This is supposedly the conflict of the series, which is very clearly between lowborn and highborn. Garrett is lowborn. He's an experienced man. He's older. He has 40 years of experience in the Night's Watch. And Waymar Royce is this young lordling, and he's coming in and commanding him. And this, of course, is very reminiscent of the military, where you sometimes have these young lieutenants coming in and commanding around very experienced servicemen and stuff like that who have nothing. This gets back to Vietnam and George's obsession with Vietnam and stuff like this. But this conflict between highborn and lowborn is established as the setting. Now, I will say that as the series goes on, it's often forgotten, he kind of goes away from this, but this is the original kind of idea that this was going to be an exploration of of class. There was going to be a class struggle here. Um, and so, we definitely see this with there's no reason that there's no real reason that Waymore Royce should be leading here. Garrett should be leading here. Garrett's the wise one. He's the smart one. He's the experienced one. And he wants to leave. And had they listened to Garrett, they'd be alive, So Will shared the unease. He had been on the wall for 4 years. First time he had been sent beyond. The interesting thing is how short all of these sentences are. And part of it's that Will's a simple man, so he has short sentences. George changes his writing style, but part of it is George changes his writing style as well as he gets to A Dance with Dragons. The first time he had been sent beyond, all those old stories came rushing back, and his bowels had turned to water. He had laughed about it afterward. He was a veteran of 100 rangings by now, and the endless dark wilderness that the Southern called the haunted forest had no more terrors for him. Until tonight. Interesting thing, the Southern, that Will himself is referring to, because Will is from the Riverlands, because he gets arrested by Malister. So it's interesting that he says the Southern here, that he's been on the wall 4 years, but now he refers to anybody south of the wall as Southern. Not something that's really kept. I mean, there's a lot of these elements that you'll see later that George kind of abandons, but that's kind of interesting that he thinks of himself as a Northerner now because he's on the wall. Until tonight, something was different tonight. They're on the edge of the darkness that made the hackles rise. 9 days they've been riding north and northwest and north again, farther and farther on the wall, and hard on the track of a band of wildling raiders. Each day had been worse than the day they'd come before it. Today was the worst of all. A cold wind was blowing out of the north, and it made the trees rustle like living things. All day, Will felt as though something were watching him, something cold and implacable, and loved him not. Garrett felt it too. Will wanted nothing but to ride, hell-bent for safety of the wall, but that was not the feeling to share with your commander. Again, this like conflict with the lords, the conflict of lowborn and highborn, the conflict of commander versus soldier, especially not a commander like this one. So Waymore Royce was the youngest son of an ancient house with too many heirs. He was a handsome youth of 18, gray-eyed and graceful and slender as a knife. Mounted on the huge black destriel, the knight moved above Will and Garrett on the smaller garrons. He wore black leather boots, black woolen pants, black moleskin gloves, and fine supple coat of gleaming black ringmail over layers of black wool and boiled leather. These were George loves boiled leather. What's funny is ringmail appears in fantasy books and stuff. Ringmail was actually not a thing; it didn't actually exist. But this is the difference between like having like there's chainmail, which exists, like when you have little chains that like fit together, and then there's like ringmail, is the idea that you have a suit with a bunch of like rings embedded in it, and apparently that's not something that historically was a thing, but it likes appearing in fantasy. But nonetheless, we're just supposed to be showing that he's got all of these nice things. There's this divide between the highborn and the lowborn. Sir Waymore had been sworn brothers of the Night's Watch for less than half a year, but no one could say he was not prepared for his vocation, at least insofar as the wardrobe was concerned. So he's this wealthy guy in the Night's Watch. Now, even this idea of honorable lords sending their extra men off to the Night's Watch, even that's kind of a it's kind of a lost idea too. Like George mentions that, he has a few people in, over the course of the series who are highborn in the Night's Watch, but it's not many, it's like, you kind of come up with like a dozen of them, out of the 100 that you can think of. But this idea of feudalism, but you're supposed to be highlighting feudalism and how like feudalism and primogeniture, like, it's everything to the eldest son. So what do you do with the others? So that they're like wasted and they're needed to be sent off to war, is this idea. We have these disposable people that need to be sent off. And so there's this mystery of like, Waymar Royce. George didn't really have he didn't explore it that much, even though that this was clearly like an established thing in a Game of Thrones. That honor, like people in their houses would feel like this is an honor. I need to go off, and that's what you do with younger children but the problem is that like I think it's because in a Game of Thrones and the whole series, people die so much that you feel like you should have spares around, being a youngest son, considering everybody's dying constantly, you'd want to keep them as spares, so I don't know. His cloak was his crown of glory, sable, thick, soft as sin. Bet he killed them all himself. Garrett told them barracks over wine, twisted their little heads off. Our mighty warrior. They all shared a laugh. Garrett is trying to claim that Waymar is somehow, I don't know, wimpy or cruel or something. It's kind of an odd line. Because we don't really get a sense of Waymar being a weirdo, that he'd want to kill a bunch of sable, a bunch of like little sables for his cloak, So anyway, it's hard to take orders from a man you laughed at in your cups, Will reflected as he sat shivering atop his Garen. Garrett must have felt the same. Doesn't everybody take orders from people that you've laughed at in your cups? Doesn't everyone make fun of their boss, especially when they're drunk? Anyway, Mormont said as we should track them, and we did. And so here we're establishing some setting here. We know that they're in the Night's Watch, and now we hear about Mormont. We hear about the G.R. Mormont, their commander. They're dead. They shan't trouble us no more. There's hard riding before us. I don't like the weather. If it snows, it could be a fortnight getting back, and the snow's the best. And the snow's the best we can hope for. Ever seen an ice storm, my lord? This is a big kind of obsession with cold that George R. Martin got. He used to live in Dubuque, Iowa, and it was a really, really cold experience there. And so he has a lot of ideas and memories about cold, ice storms and snowstorms and stuff like that. The lordling seemed not to hear him. He studied the deepening twilight in the half-bored, half-distracted way he had. Will had ridden with the night long enough to understand that it was best not to interrupt him when he looked like that. Tell me again what you saw, Will. All the details. Leave nothing out. It always seems kind of interesting because when you watch the show, like it seems like they're not that far from the wall, but they're actually like days and days they've been traveling together. So it's funny that he'd be like bringing this up now. Like they must have been talking about this story a million times over the past week. Will had been a hunter before joining the Night's Watch, a poacher in truth. Mallister free riders had caught him red-handed in the Mallister's own woods, skinning one of the Mallister's own bucks. It had been a choice of putting him in the black or losing his hand. No one could move through the woods as silent as Will. It had not taken the Black brothers long to discover his talent. So a real life conflict that was fairly common in the Middle Ages was poaching. That essentially these lords would claim a bunch of lands, and they couldn't even like keep track of them all, and people would be hungry and would go on to lands that weren't theirs and poach animals. And generally speaking, crime, the reason why you hear about crime in the Middle Ages being so harsh is because getting caught for crimes was rarity. The lands are big and it's easy to get away with stuff. How do you prove that something happened? Stuff like that. And so this is why you hear about things like hangings and limbs getting cut off, is that you want to create a harsh enough deterrent that people are weighing the risks, And so, but this is again is this conflict of lowborn versus highborn, that Mallister, just by nature of like being born into a family, owns these woods. There's probably plenty of animals in them, but Will, you know, being born poor, has to steal. Like, why is this animal and these woods Malisters? Like, it's kind of a abstract, ridiculous thing. Like, but Will, so the entire, like, why is Will on the wall? It's kind of like an unjust thing in the first place. There shouldn't have been this system where Malister owned this woods and Will had to poach, you know, in order to survive. But that's the world we live in. So again, like, a lot of time is being spent in this prologue focusing on the lowborn highborn thing, which, you know, it's not that it doesn't come up like during the story, but it's, considering that this is such a focus of this prologue, it's kind of interesting that it's kind of dropped off as a part of the plot. The camp is 2 miles farther on, over that ridge, hard beside a stream, Will said. I got close as I dared. There's 8 of them, men and women both. No children I see. They put up a lean-to against the rock. The snow's pretty well covered it now, but I could still make it out. No fire burning, but the fire pit was still plain as day. No one moving. I watched a long time. No living man ever lay so still. Did you see any blood? Well, no, Will admitted. Did you see any weapons? Some swords, a few bones. One man had an axe, heavy-looking, double-bladed, a cruel piece of iron. It was on the ground beside him, right by his hand. Did you take note of any positions of the bodies? Will shrugged. A couple are sitting up against the rock, most of them on the ground, fallen like, or sleeping, Royce suggested. Fallen, Will insisted. There's one woman up in Ironwood, half hid in the branches. Afar eyes. He smiled thinly. I took care she never saw me. When I got closer, I saw that she wasn't moving neither. Despite himself, he shivered. So this woman, Far Eyes, she's the scout, but she's dead in the tree. Is the interesting thing. You have a chill? Royce asked. Some, Will muttered. The wind, my lord. The young knight turned back to the grizzled men-at-arms. Frost-fallen leaves whispered past them, and Royce's gesture moved restlessly. What do you think might have killed these men, Garrett? Waymore asked casually. He adjusted the drape of his long sable cloak. It was the cold, Garrett said with iron certainty. I saw men freeze last winter, and one before, when I was half a boy. Everyone talks about the snowy 40-foot deep and how ice winds come howling out of the north, but the real enemy is the cold. It steals up on you quieter than will. And at first you shiver, and your teeth chatter, and you stamp your feet, and dream of mulled wine and nice hot fires. It burns, it does. Nothing burns like the cold, but only for a while. Then it gets inside you and it starts filling you up. And after a while, you don't have enough strength to fight it. It's easier just to sit down and go to sleep. You say you don't feel any pain towards the end. First you go weak and drowsy, and everything starts to fade. And then it's like sinking into a sea of warm milk, peaceful like. Kind of, you know, I guess it reminds me of the Jack London story, To Build a Fire, you know. But it's straight up George R. R. Martin poetry in there. Such eloquence, Garrett, Waymore observed. I never suspected you had it in you. I've had the cold in me too, lordling. Garrett pulled his hood back, giving Waymore a good long look at the stumps where his ears had been. 2 ears, 3 toes, and a little finger off my left hand. Of course, you know, they've been traveling together for days. They should know all this information, but, you know, we need to have this conversation. I got light off. In fact, like, Waymore Royce has been at the wall 6 months. Like, you know, so you think you'd be in the cafeteria, the mess hall, and see this kind of stuff. I got off light. I found my brother is frozen at his watch with a smile on his face. Sir Waymar shrugged. You ought to dress more warmly, Garrett. Garrett glared at the lordling, the scars around his ear holes flushed red with anger, where Maester Aemon had cut away. So we hear about Maester Aemon, you know, this early character. We'll see how warm you can dress when the winter comes. He pulled up his hood and hunched over his Garion, silent and sullen. If Garrett said it was cold, where it will begin. Again, we're getting into this whole, like, the experience thing. These are the experienced men, and Waymar just keeps ignoring them. And the only reason that Waymar is ignoring them is because they're lowborn. Like, I mean, later we get this idea that Waymar doesn't want to fail on his first mission. So there's a little bit about like something to prove, you know, this young lordling who's new at the wall, who has something to prove as a commander. Have you drawn any watches this past week? Will? Yes, my lord. There's never a week when he does not draw a bloody dozen watches. What was the man driving at? You know, it's a silly question because of course you're gonna do watches. How did you find the wall? Weeping, Will said, frowning. He saw it clear enough. Now that the lordling had pointed out, they couldn't have froze, not if the wall was weeping. It wasn't cold enough. Royce nodded. Bright lad. We've had a few light frosts this week, and a quick flurry of snow now and then, but surely no cold fierce enough to kill 8 grown men. Men clad in fur and leather, let me remind you, and with shelter near at hand, and means of making fire. The knight's smile was cocksure. Will lead us there. I would see these dead men for myself. And so now we're getting this mystery. It's not that cold, and yet these guys are frozen, or at least Will claims that they're frozen. So how did this happen? And then there was nothing to be done. The orders had been given, and honor bound them to obey. Will went in front. And that's the funny thing about honor bound, because again, like, you know, the honor of joining the Night's Watch and the honor that the vassal has for the Lord and stuff like that. What the series becomes is more of people being more calculating, and you find that like honor is not that important later on. Like, you know, the Game of Thrones kind of concept of people like truly believing in honor is kind of an interesting thing that kind of it's you know, it drops off as you get on. It's not like later you hear about people the Night's Watch talking about honor, you know, I guess, you know, maybe for the watch or something. Will in front, his shaggy little Garen picking the way carefully through the undergrowth. A light snow had fallen the night before, and there were stones and roots and hidden sinks lying just under the crust, waiting for the careless and the unwary. Sir Waymar Royce came next, his black destrier snorting impatiently. The warhorse was the wrong mount for ranging, but try and tell that to a lordling. Again, the conflict. Garrett brought it up to the rear. The old man at arms muttered to himself as he rode. Twilight deepened. The cloudless sky turned deep purple, the color of an old bruise, then faded to black. The stars began to come out. A half moon rose. Will was grateful for the light. Yeah, George R. R. Martin, the big thing about George R. R. Martin doesn't understand the moon. I don't think someone told me about half moon rise. Some people like there's been some ideas about when the half moon appears, and somebody has told me that like specifically about the half moon thing that George gets something wrong, but I forget exactly what it was. But again, it might be that the moon works differently or something. But yeah, George does a lot of weird stuff with the moon. That's like it's something like when does the like I think you can't see a half moon rise. Like it's just not how it doesn't like pass over the horizon like that. Like it's already in the sky when things become dark or something like that. Somebody might correct me on that, but I think George doesn't understand the moon. Like this is a common thing. We can make better pace than this, surely. He said when the moon was full risen. Not with this horse. Perhaps my lord would care to take the lead. Sir Raymarus did not deign to reply. Somewhere off in the woods, a wolf howled. And so we're getting the setting of, is there a dire wolf out there? Will pulled his Garen over beneath the ancient gnarled ironwood and dismounted. Why are you stopping? Sir Waymar asked. Best go the rest of the way on foot, my lord. It's just over the ridge. Royce paused a moment, staring off in the distance. A cold wind whispered through the trees. His great sable cloak stirred behind, like something half alive. That's the other thing. I think, didn't they just establish that they were only a few miles away? And now, like, the entire time passed from the moon being at the horizon to being straight overhead. Right? Am I getting that right? Yeah. They're only 2 miles away. And then, yeah, he screws up. The camp is 2 miles farther on over that ridge. But then he goes into the moon thing. And then the moon makes it all the way. They only had 2 miles. Like, that's like, it's like a 10-minute ride, if that. Is that George is horrible with distances too. I think that's maybe. um um let's see, where were we? Let's see. Well, not if the wall was weeping. How did I lose my place? Why are we stopping? Best go the rest of the way on foot, my lord. It's just over that ridge. Royce paused a moment, staring off into the distance, his face reflective. A cold wind whispered through the trees. His gray sable cloak stirred behind like something was half alive. There's something wrong here. Can you feel it? Listen to the darkness. Will could feel it. 4 years of the Night's Watch, he had never been so afraid. What was it? Wind, tree rustling, a wolf. What sound is it that unmans you so, Garrett? When Garrett did not answer, Royce slid gracefully from his saddle. He tied his gesture securely to a low-hanging limb, well away from the other horses, and drew his longsword from its sheath. So now even Royce is now finally feeling scared. And then he says, "Jewels glittered in its hilt." This is one. The jewels are to highlight his wealth, obviously, but in A Dance with Dragons, they actually find a jeweled broken sword that you're supposed to later think is Waymar Royce's. But that happens in A Dance with Dragons. I think, was it? Sapphire, yeah. They found a in John 12. He says one man surrendered a shirt of silver scales that's surely been made for some great lord. Another produced a broken sword with 3 sapphires in the hilt. So it might actually be, this idea that maybe that sword is something from Waymar. Moonlight ran down the shining steel. It was a splendid weapon, castle forged, new made from the look out of it. Will doubted it had ever been swung in anger. The tree is pressed close here. The sword will tangle you up. Better a knife. And he says, if I need instruction, I'll ask for it, the young lord said. Garrett, stay here. Again, this conflict between them. You know, the wisdom of Garrett is just ignored over and over again, um, because he's lowborn. Garrett dismounted. We need a fire. I'll see to it. How big of a fool are you, old man? If there are enemies in the woods, a fire is the last thing we want. If there's some enemies, a fire will keep it away, Garrett said. Bears and direwolves and other things. So here we hear of the direwolves again. And then he says, no fires. And I guess George does bring back the no fire aspect when we get to Jon Snow and the Corran Halfhand journey. And then he commands him no fire. Garrett's hood shadowed his face, but Will could see the hard glitter in his eyes as he stared at the night. For a moment he was afraid the older man would go for his sword. It was a short, ugly thing, a grip discolored by sweat, its edge nicked from hard use. But Will would not have given an iron bob for the lordling's life if Garen pulled it from its scabbard. So here, like, you know, Will's like, yeah, maybe they should kill Waymar. Finally, Garrett looked down. No fire, he muttered, low under his breath. Royce took it for acquiescence and turned away. Lead on, he said to Will. Will threaded their way through the thicket and started up a slope to the low ridge where he had found his vantage point under a sentinel tree. Under the thin crust of snow, the ground was damp and muddy, slick footing with rocks and hidden roots to trip you up. Will made no sounds as he climbed. Behind him, he heard the soft metallic slither of a lordling's ringmail, the rustle of leaves, the muttering curses as reaching branches grabbed at their long swords and tugged on their splendid sable cloaks. The great sentinel was right there at the top of the ridge where Will had known it would be, its lowest branches a bare foot from the ground. Will slid underneath, flat on his belly, in the snow and the mud, and looked down the empty clearing below. His heart stopped in his chest, and he did not dare breathe. Now I'm like caught up on that. No, he says, tell me again what you saw. Leave nothing out. And he says, the camp is 2 miles farther on over that ridge, hard beside a stream. I mean, does he mean farther on from the ridge, not farther on from where they are? It's such a weird thing. Okay. His heart stopped in his chest. For a moment he dared not breathe. Moonlight shone down through the clearing, the ashes of the fire pit, the snow-covered lean-to, the great rock, the little half-frozen stream. Everything was just as it had been a few hours ago. I don't know, a few hours. I don't know how the moon made it all the way from rising to being above, but it's okay. They were gone. All the bodies were gone. Gods, he heard behind them. A sword clashed at the branch as Sir Waymar Royce gained the ridge. He stood there beside the sentinel, long sword in hand, his cloak billowing behind him as winds came up, outlined nobly against the stars for all to see. A lot of really beautiful descriptions of the area. Like, George is really showing his, like, you know, his poetry in this. Get down, Will whispered urgently. Something's wrong. Royce did not move. He looked down at the empty clearing and laughed. Your dead man seems to have moved, Will. Will's voice abandoned him. He groped for words that did not come. It was not possible. His eyes swept back and forth over the abandoned campsite, stopped at the axe, a huge double-bladed battle axe, still lying where he had seen it last, untouched, a valuable weapon. On your feet, Will, Sir Waymar commanded. There's no one here. I won't have you hiding under a bush. Reluctantly, Will obeyed. Sir Waymar looked over with open disapproval. I'm not going back to Castle Black, a failure on my first ranging. We'll find these men. He glanced around. Up the tree. Be quick about it. Look for a fire. And here is, you know, the other motivation. Besides, like, Waymar just, like, wanting to stick it to the lowborn, he has this wanting to prove himself kind of, like, aspect of honor. and wanting to look good on his first job. And this is a fairly like common thing that we hear about in the Middle Ages, that these lordlings, um, they want to go off and fight in the Crusades to prove that they're deserving of all of the wealth that they were like born into and things like that. That they're bored, but they also want to like prove themselves. And so this is kind of the Waymar's personality. Will turned away, wordless. There was no use to argue. The wind was moving. It cut right through them. He went to the tree. A vaulting gray-green sentinel. He loves gray-green sentinels, so that's going to continue on. And began to climb. Soon his hands were sticky with sap, and he was lost among the needles. Fear filled his gut like a meal he could not digest. He whispered a prayer to his nameless gods in the wood and slipped his dirk free from its sheath. He put it between his teeth to keep both his hands free for the climbing. The taste of cold iron in his mouth gave him comfort. Yeah, this is, by the way, just like how things vary. It's very rare that George would start 3 sentences in a row with he. I guess he had fear here, but George likes a lot of variance, but this is like early George, so it's obviously shorter sentences, more concise, different writing style than we're going to see later on. Even if it's Will's, there's Will's personality, right? But down below, the lordling called out suddenly, "Who goes there?" Will heard uncertainty in the challenge. He stopped climbing. He listened. He watched. The woods gave answer. The rustle of leaves, the ice rush of the stream, a distant hoot of snow and owl. Didn't he say that the stream was froze hard? Maybe he's talking about the water underneath the frozen. No, I guess. No, hard beside a stream. Okay. Not a hard stream. Okay. Sorry. Who goes there? The woods gave answer, and then the others made no sound. And so I guess, I don't know if George has figured out his point of view system and how much information is known here. But it's interesting that Will knows immediately what it is. Like, he knows it's another. There's no like, what is that thing? What a weird creature. He's just like, no, that's another. Like, that's I know what that, I've heard enough stories. Because we don't actually like get that much information like from the Night's Watch later on. Everybody's kind of confused about what the others are, but here, like, no, Will knows it's another. Will saw movement from the corner of his eye, pale shapes gliding through the wood. He turned his head, glimpsed a white shadow in the darkness. Then it was gone. Branches stirred gently in the wind, scratching at one another with wooden fingers. He really loves this, like, hands and fingers of the woods. Will opened his mouth to call out a warning, and the words seemed to freeze in his throat. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps it had only been a bird, a reflection on the snow, some trick of the moonlight. What had he seen after all? It kind of goes against the idea of the other. Will, where are you? Sir Waymar called up. Can you see anything? He was turning in a slow circle, suddenly wary, his sword in hand. He must have felt them, as Will felt them. There was nothing to see. Answer me, why is it so cold? Now we get the mystery of how these guys froze, why this woman froze in a tree. It was cold, shivering. Will clung more tightly to his perch, his face pressed hard against the trunk of the sentinel. He could feel the sweet, sticky sap on his cheek. A shadow emerged from the darkness of the wood. It stood in front of Royce, tall as it was, and gaunt and hard as old bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armor seemed to change color as it moved. Here it was white as new fallen snow, there black as shadow, everywhere dapple with the deep gray-green of the tree. The patterns ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. And I think people like, take the show's idea of what others look like, but you can tell here that it's like the others are very crystal like, with this idea of like shiny and reflective and like water. That there's definitely like a reflective crystal aspect to them. And even when you see portrayals of them, I mean, that's hard to portray perhaps in art, making reflective, but that's what they are. They're more, more crystal and mirror like and reflective like than anything. Come no further. His voice cracked like his voice cracked like a boy's. He threw his sable cloak over his shoulders to free his arm for battle. Took the sword in both hands. The wind had stopped. It was very cold. The other slid forward on silent feet. Its hand was in its hand was a longsword like none Will had ever seen. No human metal had gone into forging of that blade. It was alive with moonlight, translucent, a shard of crystal, so thin that it almost seemed to vanish when seen on the edge. There's a faint blue shimmer to the thing, a ghost light that played around its edges, and somehow Will knew it was sharper than any razor. Yeah, just really beautifully written imagery. Sir Waymar met bravely. Dance with me then. He lifted his sword high over his head, defiant. His hands trembled from the weight of it, or perhaps it was the cold. Yet in that moment, Will thought, he was a boy no longer, but a man of the Night's Watch. And so yeah, we get certainly Will and this pack has a lot more sense of like honor and the honor of the Night's Watch. That gets kind of in John's head, because we don't really, the rest of the characters that we meet in the Night's Watch, especially considering so many of them are criminals or they're from mutinies and stuff like that. But this idea that like Will is quite proud and Garrett is quite proud and Waymar is quite proud, and you have these three very proud Night's Watchmen that don't necessarily represent like the ones we see later on. You don't hear too much about it. I mean, you hear about it from John. Like John feels that way, but we think of John being exceptional, but it might just because from this point on, like everybody's a mutineer. You got mutineers, and then you have the assassination attempt, of John and stuff like that. The other halted. Will saw its eyes, blue, deeper and bluer than any human eyes, a blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the longsword, trembling on high, watched the moonlight running cold along the metal. For a heartbeat he dared to hope. They emerged silently from the shadows. Twins to the first, 3 of them, 4, 5. Sir Waymar may have felt the cold that came with them, but he never saw them. He never heard them. Will had to call out. It was his duty and his death if he did. He shivered and hugged the tree and kept the silence. Yeah, it's very clear that this fight scene, George clearly spent a lot of time on. It's just beautifully written. The pale sword came shivering through the air. Sir Waymar met it with steel. When the blades met, there was no ring of metal on metal, only a huge thin sound of at the edge of hearing, like an animal screaming in pain. Royce checked a second blow and a third, and then fell back a step, another flurry of blows, and he again fell back again, behind him, to the right, to the left, all around. The watchers stood patient, faceless, silent, the shifting patterns of their delicate armor making them all but invisible to the wood. Yet they made no move to interfere. That's the interesting thing, right? That they kind of all just stop and watch this actual sword fight that goes on, and Waymar fights for a while. I think because in the show I think he's just like killed immediately, but the fact that like the others stop and like observe this sword fight and seem to have a your champion against our champion kind of idea to it is very interesting. They're all just all the others are standing around and just watching this fight. Then Royce's parry came a beat too late. The pale sword bit through the ring mail beneath his arm. The young lord cried out in pain. Blood welled through the rings. It steamed in the cold, and the droplets seemed red as fire when they touched the snow. Sir Waymar's fingers brushed his side. His moleskin glove came away soaked with red. The other said something in a language Will did not know. His voice was like the cracking of ice on a winter lake, and the words were mocking. And I always wondered about that, if the other really was mocking Waymar Royce or not, or if it's just Will's perception. I mean, obviously, if you think of the others as just like this malevolent evil force, then yes, like, of course they would just mock somebody they defeated. But at the same time, they all stood back and like watched this one-on-one fight. Kind of weird, right? So I don't know. I don't know if it's like it's true mocking or not. Anyway, so Raymar Royce found his fury. For Robert, he shouted and came up snarling, lifting the frost-covered longsword with both hands and swinging it around in a flat sidearm slash with all of his weight behind it. The other's parry was almost lazy. When the bloods touched, the steel shattered. Now, this asks for Robert aspect. Now, obviously, this is like world building and establishing things. Like we've established, like the leader of the Night's Watch, the healer of the Night's Watch, and now we're introducing the king of the land for Robert, and you know he's going in for honor, and this is very it's almost so like cheesy that that we think of Knights of the Round Table or Lord of the Rings, somebody like yelling their king's name while going into battle, and it's completely abandoned after this. No one at any point yells for Robert or for Joffrey or for Tommen. I don't. Does anyone yell for Rob or anything like this? I don't think it's ever utilized ever again. But for some reason, Waymar Royce yells for Robert while heading into battle because he's, has such dedication to his king and the honor of his king. Or maybe, maybe it's for Robert Aaron. No, because John Aaron's still alive. John Aaron's still alive at this point. So it's not even for Robert Aaron because, later on we kind of feel that people are a little more loyal to their local lord than they are to the king. The king is far away. But Waymar Royce, for Robert, honor kind of guy. Anyway, we never see another character yell out a king's name, Like Arya has a whole thing about like Winterfell and stuff like that, like her battle cry. But it's kind of a funny thing. Anyway, when the blades touched, the steel shattered. A scream echoed through the forest night, and the longsword shivered into 100 brittle pieces. The shards scattered like rains of needles. Royce went to his knees, shrieking, covered his eyes. The blood welled between his fingers. The watchers moved forward together, as if some signal had been given. And this is this idea that perhaps they have hive-mindedness, that they move together. And in fact, even the attack on the Fist of the First Men, it seems like a coordinated attack. So there's this wonder, that they do seem to be hive-minded. Because you don't hear any crackling command or anything like that. But then they hack him up, right? The watchers moved forward together as if some signal had been given, and the swords rose and fell, all in deathly silence. It was cold butchery. The pale blades sliced through the ringmail as if they were silk. Will closed his eyes. And beneath, he heard the voices as laughter sharp as icicles. So again, this like mocking cruelty that they all go over there laughing and slice him up. I don't know why they did that. That's a weird thing. No one ever talked about like why did they all decide to just go over and like, they could have just killed him, cut his throat, but they just went in there. All of them went started like chopping him up into pieces. Like what was the point? For fun, for laughter. Anyway, when he found the courage to look again, a long time had passed, and the ridge below was empty. How'd they get rid of all the they picked up all the pieces and left. He stayed in the tree, scarce daring to breathe. Oh, But there's the other thing is we know that Waymar comes back as an other, but it's weird because they all go forward and they start going like they don't really hack him to too many pieces. Hmm. When he found the courage, he looked on. A long time had passed. Ridge below was empty. He stayed in the tree, scarce daring to breathe. Finally, he climbed down. Royce's body lay face down in the snow, one arm outflung. The thick sable cloak had been slashed in a dozen places, lying dead like that. I guess they didn't really just hack him up. They just went in and all stabbed him for some reason. They all choose to stab him, I guess. Like this is some sort of Julius Caesar death or something, you know? Lying dead like that, he saw how young he was, a boy. He found, now you kind of feel this pity because like before Will didn't care if Garrett was going to kill him, but now he sees him dead and he's a boy and he's like, oh geez, now he feels bad. He found what was left of the sword a few feet away. The end splintered and twisted like a tree struck by lightning. Will knelt, looked around warily and snatched it up. The broken sword would be his proof. Garrett would know what to make of it, and if not him, then surely that old bear Mormont or Maester Aemon. Would Garrett still be waiting with the horses? He had to hurry. Will rose. Sir Waymar Royce stood over him. His fine clothes were a tatter, his face a ruin. So I guess they just hacked him up for some reason. A shard of his sword transfixed the blind white pupil of his left eye. The right eye was open. The pupil burned blue. It saw. The broken sword fell from nerveless fingers. So this I always wonder about this phrase nerveless fingers, because nerveless fingers is like what people mean, like I've lost my nerve and so or I've lost my energy and you drop it, but like you kind of get maybe this double meaning that it's so cold that his nerves have like frozen and so they're nerveless. I don't know if George was thinking about that because the phrase nerveless fingers like means like you're exhausted and just don't have any energy left in him. Will closed his eyes to pray. Long, elegant hands brushed his cheek, then tightened around his throat. They were gloved in the finest moleskin and sticky with blood. Yet the touch was ice cold. So he's actually like looking over him, and Waymar Royce reaches up and grabs him, which I suppose. Oh no, Will rose. So Waymar stood over him. So I guess he's already standing there. Because and then he grabs him. I suppose there's little elements of like Oberyn being close to the mountain and the mountain like grabbing him, like the dead rising and taking somebody out. Anyway, that's the prologue. So yeah, just you can see in the middle, you can see it's just beautifully written. George spent a lot of time on it. There's a lot of elements that are introduced here as a beginning setting that we kind of see abandoned by George later. Not everything makes sense in it, but which is fine. Not everything in it, not everything's gonna make sense. But like, there's definitely some weird things I didn't think that I'd forgotten about, like why all the others went in there and started stabbing him a bunch, like Julius Caesar, but there's you can see a lot of elements that are not really continued on, but at the time, like if this was written in 1991, you think, between it and A Dance with Dragons, it's 20 years later. So anyway, so we'll continue on next time. Thanks. I'll talk to you later.